Right then, all welcome back. Wow, what a race! What a race! And it wasn't the most exciting race. I felt it didn't have. There wasn't lots of action, but it was a little bit unpredictable in the way in which it finished. In a sense, and we can come on to that in a shortly, I guess. But I guess one of the things if I'm gonna it's a difficult one to put through this. So where do you start with this? Firstly, let's start with Ferrari and Leclerc. A mixed day for it was a mixed day for Ferrari because Sainz obviously went out early, and it was sort of finished off a sort of a very unfortunate weekend, I guess, for Leclerc for Sainz. But Leclerc, what a race, and so comfortable in the win. Okay, he had two or three laps perhaps where Verstappen pushed, and at one point Verstappen may have been, you could argue, was the quicker at the first in those first 10 laps or so. Um, he was held up, but as a result of that holding up, he did use up those tires and he used them up pretty damn quickly. And we'll come into that with Max Verstappen and we analyze his race in a minute. But Leclerc held his own. He made it difficult for Verstappen to overtake. Verstappen, the inevitable happened, the tyres run out. And after that point, Leclerc, even after a pit stop where Leclerc had a 5.5 second gap, and the safety car closed the pack up. There again, Leclerc was perhaps a little bit sleepy on the restart of the safety car, but holds his own. And then, the rest was history. And before the Verstappen incident with Verstappen going out the race, made no difference whatsoever because Leclerc was several seconds in front. I say several, it was what, 7, 8, 9 seconds in front at that point, and was only gaining and getting further and further into the distance anyway. So, in the context of things, Verstappen was never really in contention apart from the first few laps of the race. He was never really in contention to win the race. Now, right, so yeah, early morning coffee. So it was an early race, first early race of the season, first time in Australia for 3 years, and it was so there was it was an interesting to be back there in Australia again. You almost forgotten. It almost feels like it's a new race, isn't it? A new circuit. It's been 3 years in Australia. We get a little ankle biter running around by my ankles. And it was it didn't. It was going to be. It was always going because it was obviously the new era of these Formula One cars at Australia, which we haven't raced for 3 years now. So it was always going to be interesting to see how the cars coped and how the race was going to be. But we have to go now on to what happened for Red Bull and Verstappen, and another DNF. That's 2 in 3 races for Verstappen, and it's not just it's not like it's a suspension issue, a brake issue. It's yet again more issues. Maybe not necessarily directly the engine, but engine related or in and around that area of the car, whether it be the fuel pump or an oil leak, hydraulic fluids, etc. All centralizes around the larger picture in that area of the car with the engine. And when Red Bull already had themselves 3 retirements for the season, the 2 obviously in the first race of the season in Bahrain, and then 1 today. And when you consider the sister car has had 3 retirements themselves, so there's 4 cars with the legacy Red Bull engine or legacy Honda engine. The Red Bull controlled engine, but legacy Honda engine. 4 cars, that is the 2 Red Bulls and the 2 AlphaTauris. Every one of those cars, we're only 3 races in, have had failures, some of them multiple. And we're only 3 races in. That is a very bad sign going forward for Red Bull. 2 reasons why. Firstly, if they're still having issues and they don't know what there is, and certainly from from what we've been led to believe. Again, I wouldn't always trust what teams say. Teams will tell people what they want people to hear, but it certainly seems like when you consider what's going on with the Alpha Towers as well, that there's an issue with that engine, where at least with some of the components within the engine. So if they haven't quite sorted it yet, that's obviously going to be an issue, and it's going to be a concern going forward to the end of the season. But the other thing to consider as well is the fact that while that is going on, they are almost certainly going to have to use more engines this season. And more engines means penalties, grid place penalties, particularly as we move on towards as the season progresses and so on. So I guess the first thing is Red Bull going to struggle to compete, not just in terms of the drivers' championship, but in constructors as well. In fact, let's look at the timings, and I can also show you the standings. And this is where things become a little bit surprising when you look at the bigger picture. So this was the total. So this was today's race. This is the official classified standings, barring any late penalties and whatnot that may be discussed after the race and so on. But certainly not towards the front of the race. Leclerc, miles in front, followed by Perez. Russell getting a podium there for Mercedes, and Hamilton fourth. Two McLarens, fifth and sixth. Excellent day for them. And I suppose in that respect, we're seeing a bit more of return to normality in that the four biggest manufacturers or constructors in Formula One are your Ferraris, your McLarens, your Red Bulls, and Mercedes. Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLarens. So the four biggest cars or four biggest manufacturers are now sort of almost normal service resumed in that respect, and that the biggest teams are at the front of the grid again. Whether that's a short thing because it's a street race in Australia and so on, whether that carries on to back to the next races or not, it remains to be seen. But good signs for McLaren and Mercedes. Yes, okay, they're slightly elevated because of the the Verstappen going out incident and Carlos Sainz as well. So you could argue they're a couple of places further forward when they would have been. But when you consider where they were 2 weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, and they were nowhere to be seen. So there are certainly signs of improvement by the McLaren and Mercedes. Mercedes powered cars turning up that engine a little bit, finding some, managing to make small little changes to the car. That's just helping them a little bit. Obviously, once we get back to Europe, we'll see a lot more in terms of. Morning, Rob. Hope you're doing all right, mate. We should see more upgrades once we get back to Spain, once we get back to Barcelona. And the reason why teams do more in the way of upgrades when they get back to Europe is quite simply it's cheaper. They're in Australia. Most of the factories in Europe, a lot of them are actually in the UK. It's expensive to ship parts out to places like Australia and so on. It's very expensive. A lot of teams wait until that first. And actually, when they get back to Barcelona as well, they can make very quick turnaround times as well, parts, because it's an hour and a half, 2 hour flight. So they can find things that put that a problem in the morning and have new parts there by the afternoon. You can't do that in Australia. It takes a day and a dollar. So it's not. So once we get back to Spain, to Barcelona, we'll find that teams will focus more on upgrades. And now, really, okay, what have Mercedes and McLaren done to move that far up the grid? Probably a change in the setup. They might have one or two small parts that they've shipped out because there is a 2-week gap, and obviously you've got a little bit of time there, and they are teams that obviously have big budgets. So they probably made some small changes. There wouldn't have been anything notable. That will be when they get back to Spain. But also, if the rumours are right, and they are rumours because we can't ever tell really what's going on in the team, but if the Mercedes-powered cars, because of the aerodynamic issues that they've had, have been running their engines on a lower mode, they may have just tweaked it up a notch, possibly. If they've got a bit more balance and a bit more drivability in the car, then obviously that's going to switch the engine up a little bit more, which apparently they had been holding that back in order to save the engine for when the car is running better. If we look at the standings, and this is the bit that in fact, we'll go to the driver standings. And this is, firstly, we look at Leclerc. He's moving very nicely out front. Look at George Russell, second in the drivers. How on earth have Mercedes had such a poor start to the season as they have, and have got a driver second in the constructors? That is a failing on Red Bull's part. Look at Max Verstappen down in sixth. He's already what 50 odd 45 46 points behind Leclerc, the leader. That's essentially almost two race wins and two DNFs. You know, that's quite a gap already. Bear in mind we're only 3 races in, and the Ferrari looks a stable, reliable, and ultimately very fast car. I would say at this stage, it's it's very. I know, look, it's a long way to go, and lots of things are going to happen between now and the end of the season. There's going to be lots of changes to the cars because these are new cars. Remember, these are brand new design, new concept, new regulations. It's going to take a little bit of time for some cars to get the feel, get the hang of things, and parts and so on. So I do expect this to change, and we're already seeing, the Hasses, for example, had struggled yesterday in qualifying, having looked very good in the first couple of races. That's not necessarily that Haas have got something, doing anything wrong. It's just that other teams with bigger budgets are starting to figure out the cars a little bit better, and that's obviously going to have an impact going forward. So that's a surprise there. George Russell second, but look at this is bad for Red Bull. This will hurt Red Bull. Look at that. Red Bull have had a faster car, and they have got a better car at this moment in time than the Mercedes, and yet they are 10 points behind them in constructors. Now, 10 points in constructors isn't a lot, but Mercedes, they're second, having had a bad start to the season. I say bad start, a weak start to the season, and yet they are in second constructors championship. That for Red Bull is not a good look. And McLaren look fourth. They've had a poor start to the season. They're fourth. So, and the Aston Martin have, clearly down at the bottom there, have had a shocking start to their season with one thing or another, COVID, crashes, and all sorts. So there we go. I can't quite understand in terms of, let's go back to the live timings. I can't quite understand what Red Bull are going to have to sort out these issues, and they're going to have to sort them out quickly. It's obvious that they're not going to get through the season without penalties on their engines, because they are going to have to. And even if the engine is usable, just because you can use it again, you can. So if you've got an engine failure, you can fix it. You are allowed to fix your engines. You don't have to replace every engine that goes wrong with. But there's a caveat to that. But if you fix the engine, you might not be able to get it to the same level as what a new engine would be. And you might not be able to run it as hard. It might be more fragile. There might be more chance of it going wrong because it's already been broken before. It's like if you break a glass, okay, you can use some glue, you can put it back together, and you can use it, but it'll be very fragile, and it wouldn't take much for it to break again. Going on a very, I know it's an extreme analogy there, but the same principle applies with a Formula One engine. Sometimes you can fix it, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to run it to the same tune, the same level as what you might have done previously. And so sometimes it's worth, we'll take the pain, we'll take the one race, we'll put a new engine in, we'll take the penalty for it, but we'll have an engine that we can run the next 6 or 7 races at a much better, much higher sort of power, and so on. So sometimes you need to take that short-term pain for long-term gain. I suspect Red Bull are going to have to use engine parts up, or engines going into the season as we move forward, because they're having issues. And there's no doubt that whether it be something to do with the hydraulics, whether it's a fuel pump, etc., it's a component within the engine. Now, when I say that, I don't mean replacing a hose for the fuel pump isn't going to affect the engine performance, obviously, but it's you don't have these issues with your engines and not have components within the engine that you perhaps need to replace. You have a certain amount of tokens, so you can change a certain amount of things within the engine in terms of its performance, and because you have a certain amount of tokens, but and then and certainly with the power unit, for example, the back of the Red Bull caught fire today. Very good chance, by the way, that means that power unit might no longer be any good. That's the thing, and so if you use a power unit, guess what? Grid penalty. So there are going to be penalties that I'm convinced of Red Bull, not in the immediate future, but looking forwards, going forward in the next, this, with 3 races in, there's 19 races to go. They've already had 2 DNFs around the engine area. What I mean is, it's not as though it's a brake failure. It's not as though the brakes have failed, or it's not because they've had a suspension failure, or they've had some bodywork issues and so on. These issues around the Red Bull and the AlphaTauri, who are all on Honda or historic Honda-powered engines, have had several big issues and therefore DNFs so far this season. They need to get on top of that, and they need to get on top of that quickly. Leclerc starting to pull away a little bit, very comfortable. Leclerc out front today. Again, and this brings to another point. We saw Vettel for the first 10 laps or so. Verstappen had a run at Leclerc. In fact, I thought the first 10 laps, Leclerc was hounded by Verstappen. Verstappen was pushing him. He was in the DRS range and so on. And after the first safety car restart as well, there were signs there where Verstappen looked like he could push and challenge Leclerc. However, what we now know was that he did so at the expense of his tyres, because after 12 laps, he was radioing through and saying, "My left tyre's gone." So Red Bull, we've already established, you go back to the previous 2 races, the Red Bulls were definitely having to change their tyres quicker than the Ferraris. The Ferraris were much more comfortable at tyre degradation. Red Bulls were using up their tyres quickly. So obviously that is going to affect your performance over a race. But I think one thing this shows and it was Verstappen more than anyone else. Verstappen was one of the first people on the radio saying, "I've got major tyre deg, my left tyre's gone, the grip's gone," and so on and so forth. Perez wasn't necessarily having the same struggles. Although Perez, notably, you looked at his lap times, because he went past George Russell and he went off into the distance, and then George Russell came back at him. And had Perez have not pitted where he pitted, there was a good chance that Russell would have overtaken him on that particular pit straight, on that lap. So Red Bull do have an issue with the tyres, but I've said this for a long time, and I'll say it again: Verstappen doesn't yet have that ability or that patience to play the long game. So he goes in, he uses his tyre up early. The only exception is if he's out in front and he's got the pace and he doesn't need to push as hard, So when that is the case, those tyres tend to last him a bit longer. But certainly this season, what we're seeing, he's not the fastest. He hasn't got the fastest car, and he's continuously having to be, okay, he won the race in Saudi Arabia, but he won it with a couple of laps to go. Other than that, he was never in front at any point throughout the race, including in Bahrain. So it's when he's behind and he's trying to push and he's not playing the longer game. So he's pushing Leclerc early on, and he pushed him after the safety car. It's fine, but normally you push a lap, you push a couple of laps, and then you need to drop off and save a bit of tyres and so on, and leave yourself with a strategy. The problem is that the overtake. So because Verstappen used his tyres up so quickly, that they weren't able to filter him back into a space of air. So he had to run 3 or 4 laps longer on tyres that had clearly worn out, because there was no gap to place him into. And that's because he used the tyres up too quick, and that because he pushed harder for longer than perhaps he should have. After a couple of laps, he should have backed off a little bit and played the longer strategy game. Keep to timed targets and so on. So, and those time targets are specifically not so that it's a gap closing. It's where can we bring you out? Where can we put you? Well, it's a 20 roughly 20-second pit stop, 20 seconds back leaves us here. There's the cars there. So they are lapping at this pace. So if we lap at this pace, we know that come the time we want to pit, there's going to be a gap there. The problem is Verstappen had used those tyres up because he pushed for too long. He didn't play the long game. Again, we're seeing this weakness with Verstappen where he can't play the long game. It's all about pushing. And I know some people say, well, that's racing. You need to push all the time. No, racing is, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's a 58 lap race today. You're pushing for 5 or 6 laps and you jeopardize the next 50. This is the problem that Verstappen is going to have. Even when he isn't having engine failures, he's having problems with tyres and tyre deg. And that's because he's not playing the long game. If he had played the longer game and kept himself a second and a half back from Leclerc by not using up those tyres, then come the time to pit when there was a gap, the undercut becomes optional. However, because they weren't able to pit him when they wanted to pit him when his tyres had gone, because there was no gap, guess what happens? The undercut was far too out of reach because by the time he pitted, the gap was about 8 or 9 seconds. If he come out with about a 5.5 second gap, so if he was able to pit 2 or 3 laps earlier, he would have the undercut would have been on. But he couldn't pit 2 or 3 laps earlier because there was no gap, and there was no gap because Verstappen hadn't met timed targets. And I don't mean quick enough timed targets. I mean, that's all well and good. The team will rage him because when he's here, very small snippets of what happens in terms of the communications between the race wall and the driver, and there would be timed targets. Our time target is 1:21.6. If you go quicker than the 1:21.6, guess what? You're out of target. You might be quick and it might be good, but you're out of target. The 1:21.6, 1:21.6, whatever the timed targets are, those targets are specifically to filter you into a gap that they have looked for. Verstappen didn't meet the time targets, and therefore there was no gap there for him to fit into. It ultimately cost him 3 or 4 laps, racing on a tyre that was no longer good for him. He was having to race slower. And in the end, what happens? You end up pitting 9 seconds behind the race leader instead of 5. And then the undercut becomes completely, and there's no chance of an undercut at that point. So that is the Australian Grand Prix done. The next race, in fact, let's have a look at the schedule because we've got a decent schedule coming up. Next race is Italy on April 22nd, 24th. That will be an interesting race. We may see some upgrades there. And because it's all a bit changed, isn't it? Because it's really weird because normally for years we've always had, it's always been you have your Australia, Malaysia, China, etc., that side of the world, and then they fly to Europe for April, May sort of time with Spain and so on. But no, we're going to Italy. Then it's United States for Miami, street race in Miami, May the 6th, May the 8th. Looking forward to that. Personally, I've been to Miami. I love it there, and it'll be interesting because, and the thing I like about Miami, and what I think be interesting is the weather is very unpredictable. It could be blazing sunshine at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. By 2:30, it could be torrential thunderstorms. So that will throw up potentially some issues, or some unpredictability. Also, the humidity. How are these cars going to cope with such? And it is that Florida is a very humid place. There's a lot of moisture in the air. It's off the coast of the Caribbean. It's a very humid place. How are the cars going to cope with that humidity and with the predictability or the unpredictability of thunderstorms, particularly in the afternoon, which is when races are run and so on. So that'll be interesting. And then of course we move to Spain and Barcelona, and it'll be interesting to see how we get on there. Anyway, take care all. I will probably do another analysis video during the week if I get time. I didn't do a live watch along this week purely because it was very early. 6 o'clock a.m. UK time was the start. And getting out of bed at 5 minutes to 6 to watch it. So, but I will be doing a live watch along for Italy in a week's time, 2 weeks time. What was it? Next, the 8th, the 22nd. Yeah, so 2 weeks time. So I will be back for that. Take care, all, and I guess I'll see you all on the next one.